I'm Asian American. I live in Oak Park, and I wouldn't be here. I literally wouldn't exist today if it wasn't for black activists and the civil rights movement of the 1960s. My parents moved to Chicago in the early 1970s. 10 years earlier, and they wouldn't have been able to move here at all, because prior to a major immigration law that was passed in 1965, most immigration from Asian countries was limited to just 100 people per year. Let's think about that for a second. In 1965, 11 million people moved to the United States. India and China had the largest populations in the world, yet only 100 people were able to come here from each of those countries. The rest of those millions of people immigrated to the United States from largely white European countries. So that immigration law was a big deal. It made it possible for my parents to come here at all. But how did the law get passed after literally decades of exclusion? Let's look at some of the things that were happening at the time. The civil rights movement of the 1960s was catalyzed by two major events in 1955. The brutal murder of a young black teenage boy, 14 years old, named Emmett Till from Chicago, and Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus. My parents were both teenagers at the time, living in rural India. The 10 years following Emmett Till's murder were filled with brutal violence, while powerful black leaders emerged across the United States, including Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. My dad remembers reading his I Have a Dream speech in a local newspaper in India. The movie Selma illustrates how these 10 years led to a huge mass of people across the country demanding change and a president and Congress ready to pass meaningful legislation. This led to huge landmark civil rights bills like the Voting Rights Act in 1965 that prohibits racial discrimination in voting. 2 months later, that huge immigration bill that allowed my parents to move here was passed. It's not a coincidence that that bill was passed at the height of the civil rights movement. Congress and the legislature were focused on racial equality, a perspective that paved the way for an overhaul of the immigration system. Asian American activists of the 1960s, like Yuri Kochiyama and Grace Lee Boggs, were clear that black and Asian liberation were closely tied to one another, and Asian American activists today continue their legacy. While it was rooted in a response to demands for racial equality, that landmark immigration bill actually cemented a wedge between black and Asian communities in the United States because of one important detail. It only allowed for the immigration of skilled workers, like nurses, engineers, and doctors. So Asians were only allowed to move to the United States if they were seen as being able to add wealth to this country, which privileged those who already held power back in their home countries. While black people have had what little wealth they could accumulate, along with their very lives, taken away from them time and time again for hundreds of years. This led to harmful patterns that were at play before the bill was passed and still operate today, like the needs of lower class immigrants being ignored even though our economy depends on their labor, and Asians being held up as model minorities against black people as a way to say, see, if they can succeed, surely you can too, you must just not be working hard enough. These tropes ignore the conditions by which different people migrate, by choice or by force. Nonetheless, as a direct outcome of the hard-fought victories of the 1960s civil rights movement, my parents were able to come here and create lives for themselves here in Chicago. The wave of civil rights laws of the 1960s demonstrates how when we collectively put our efforts towards lifting up the most marginalized people in our societies, every single one of us benefits. In my case, by that 1965 immigration law. I stand on the shoulders of Yuri Kochiyama and Grace Lee Boggs, and I say Black Lives Matter because I know in the deepest part of my soul that I'll never really experience freedom and liberation until all black people are free.